Hi everyone and welcome to our first seasonal Super Scrap Spectacular. And yeah, that is a little bit of a mouthful. If it's successful, I hope to make more of these tutorials in the coming months. And the hope is to give you some hints and tips and ideas on how to use up all your scrappy bits of fabric, and also maybe come into the shop and help us clear some of our scrappy bits as well. So the tutorial that I'm going to share with you today, and the reason that I am dressed like this, is because I'm going to show you how to make one of these super scrappy droopy elf hats. And this one's mine, which I made last year. It's got a lovely dingle dangle embellishment on the end, and as you can see, it's nice and droopy. They're designed as a one size fits all, and you can adjust it. Actually, you can adjust the fit, so if you want a bit of a looser fit, you just drop down the brim a little bit and it makes it a little bit bigger. And if it's feeling a little bit too large, you just tip up the brim a bit and you get a tighter fit around your head. So it is pretty much a one size fits all, but if you do feel like this is not going to be big enough for whoever you're making it for, and you want to adjust the pattern, I'll give you a little hint on how we can do that when we get to it. So to make a droopy elf hat like this, you're going to need some scrap pieces of fleece, and it's get creative time really. Obviously I've made this to look a little bit more like Christmas colours with the reds and the greens, but you could make it more traditional than this, or you can go completely wild and wacky. This is one that I think I'm going to make for myself, with a fabulous stripy autumn sort of stripe and a purple brim at some point in the future. Whatever takes your fancy. And then there are loads of options obviously to embellish the brim and the main body of the hat as we go through. So you can see on this one, for example, I've just appliqued little hearts. So there are lots of choices on how to embellish and make these your own completely individual droopy elf hats. But to make the droopy elf hat, what we need is a pattern. And there are two ways you can get your hands on a pattern. So you can either call into the shop and we'll just draft you off a template, which you can then take home, keep as a hard copy and trace out on A4 or greaseproof paper to make your own patterns. And then if you do want to do different sizes, you can trim them down or scale them up, whatever you need to do. If you can't get into the shop because you're not local or for other reasons, the next option is to go to our Facebook page and go to the files section and download the printed pattern. All the sheets have got a little number, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll help you with that when we're taping together so you can see how they go together. There's also a scale for you on sheet number 2, and it measures 10 centimetres. This has been printed off from my printer, and the scale has remained true, so you do need to check that before you cut out, because if you've not checked and it's been scaled down, then you're going to end up with a smaller sized hat. If you do find that it's scaled it down, you may need to tweak with your printer settings using borderless printing and that type of thing. So once you've got your pattern, obviously you also need fabric, and the dimensions of the hat. The main body of the hat is 45 centimetres high and 35 wide, and the brim, the trim here, is just 35 centimetres wide by 20 centimetres high. That's the max dimensions that you'll need. The other things that you might need if you want to embellish would be buttons, beads, ribbons, bits and pieces for your dingle dangle on the end if you want to do one of those, and then I think we're pretty much ready to go. So here we are with our pattern pieces printed off. If you have managed to call into the shop to collect a template, you can skip this bit because obviously you've got your pattern pieces in full already. But let's just go through them. So we've got sheet 1, sheet 2 with our scale. Don't forget to check that that is still 10 centimetres and it's retained its integrity. Piece number 3 and piece number 4. Now I did draft this by hand, so the edges may be a little bit wibbly wobbly, but once it's taped together, it does. I've already constructed one and it does work out really well. Okay, so we've got all our pieces cut out. I'm going to start by layering piece number 1 on top of piece number 2. There's a marker here which matches here in the bottom left hand corner of number 2, and when we have all 4 pieces together, that's going to make a nice red cross. And if we just line it up with the red edge of piece number 2, creating that cross at the bottom and ensuring that it's matching at the top. Just going to put a little dab of tape in the middle so it doesn't move around, and then do a long length of tape all the way down. Okay, that's as simple as that. So here we are with the pattern all taped together, and before we cut out into our 2 pieces of the main body of the hat and the brim, this would be the time, if you think you may need to alter it, to just adjust your pattern. Okay, so this is the widest bit of the hat, which is going to give us our fit. That's where the brim tends to fold back to on this, along this solid black line here. So if you need, you know you're going to need a wider hat, then obviously just scale out your pattern, and then you'll have to do the same on the brim, because remember this bit lays over and folds in. So any adjustment that you make here and here, you will also need to make the corresponding sides here and here. If you needed to make it narrower for any reason, then just skim off the edge and again make a similar adjustment on the brim. So the finished measurement will be about 58 centimeters or 23 inches. And remembering as well that fleece is stretchy, you know, it's got quite a bit of give in it. It's not tight and fitted, so that's the sort of finished constructed size. Okay, but this is the time to make any adjustments before you grab the paper scissors and cut up your pattern. If you're ready to do that, go ahead and cut out your pieces. Okay, so once you've got your 2 pattern pieces constructed and cut out with a neat cut, if you really want to keep this as a template, you can always redraft it onto a piece of tissue paper, or greaseproof paper is quite a good handy thing that lots of people have in the house that works really well as pattern paper. If you need to do that, go ahead. But the next bit really is to pin the pattern on your chosen bits of fabric. So I'm going to go with fairly non-traditional here. I'm going to use a pink with a white spot for the main body of the hat, and a little contrast, this bird contrast, to make the brim. If you're careful with your positioning of your pattern pieces, if you've got slightly oversized pieces, you might find that you've actually got enough to just squeeze out a brim for another hat. Okay, so think about how you're positioning your pattern, pin it in place and cut out. And when you've got that ready, you've got your main body, 2 pieces of main body of the hat. You need 2 pieces for the hat, and you need 2 pieces for the brim. This one, just be careful. Obviously, if you just fold your fabric and cut it, you're going to have one side of the brim upside down. So it might be better to just cut them out one at a time. These are unique either side. It's not the same dimensions. I've drafted this by hand, so it's not perfect. If you tried to measure it all up, it probably would be quite irregular, to be honest. So make sure, if you do have to do 2 pattern pieces, just make sure that when you've done the one side, that you then flip it to the other side. Okay, so pin on your pattern pieces, cut them out, and I'll see you back here in a minute or 2. So got everything cut out now. 2 pieces for the main body, 2 pieces for the brim, and I did manage to salvage another brim for another hat, so we can put that away for another day. Okay, so next job then is to embellish, if you wish to embellish the main body of the hat. I'm not going to go overboard with this because we've got 2 prints, and I'd actually quite like to sew some of these little bells on to the peaks after the hat's constructed. But I will just show you how to sew buttons on using a sewing machine, in case you've never done that before. First of all, make sure that you're looking at the right side of your fabric, because you may have cut it out right sides together. So turn it to the right side and then fold back a third, fold back the brim. So I've raided my my button jar, and I've just found some nice pink and purple buttons. and these little wooden hearts that I'm going to sew on. You'll notice that I've not put anything close to the edge because we don't want anything close to where we're going to be sewing our seam, and nothing in the bottom 2/3 because it's just not going to be visible, so it's not worth our time. Okay, so heading over to the machine now, we're going to actually get on and do a little bit of sewing. So I'm standing now at the sewing machine, and I'm just going to show you how to sew on a button using the machine if you haven't already. You need to set your machine to a static zigzag, so stitch length 0, and the zigzag will depend, the width of the zigzag stitch will depend on how wide the gap is between your buttonhole. I'm going to show you first sewing on a button using a universal foot. If you've got a button foot for your machine, that's fantastic. I don't have one, and over the years I've tried different ways to do this, so you can do it with your universal foot. This is the most tricky, but it is possible to do it as long as you can see where the buttonholes are. So you position it so that the gap between the center of the gap between the buttonholes is in line with the groove on your presser foot, and then just drop the presser foot down and it should catch and hold the button in place. And then the first thing to always do is to ensure with the first stitch when you're doing a buttonhole, now my machine actually does an anchor stitch first, so it does 3 stitches in the same place. I'm just going to do it by hand using the hand wheel, because when that needle flips across to the right there, I want to make sure that it's set to the right width. So very carefully back into the buttonhole. If it is, all well and good. If it isn't, then you just need to make an adjustment. That one's fitting really nicely, so I'm just going to go ahead and sew it in place. And my machine paces itself as a set number of stitches. Okay, so you can see that. Lovely, easy button stitched on using the sewing machine. I'm going to now show you a couple of different feet, because you might have a few different feet in your arsenal. So that was a universal foot. I've also got 2 different embroidery feet for my machine, an open-toed embroidery foot, which is really handy for sewing buttons on because it holds them in place. Obviously, it can't do anything smaller than the gap, but I'll show you. You can see your stitching really easily. You can see the button and the buttonholes really straightforwardly. So let's just go ahead and show you how this works. So again, picking your button, putting it in place, sitting it underneath the presser foot and dropping down. And again, I'm just going to do the first stitch by hand, turning the hand wheel to make sure that the button is in an okay position and it's not slipping under the presser foot. And there we go. And if you don't have an open-toed embroidery foot, you might actually have a darning foot or a round embroidery foot, which is this one. Okay, so you can just see how that's going to be really helpful to hold a button in place. So positioning it on the machine and then selecting another button. So remembering to keep your buttons in the top third of the hat. You can see how great that is at just holding your button in place. And again, first couple of stitches by hand, just to check that when it flips across to the right, it's going into the hole, it's not going to break the needle, or in some cases split and break the button. So there you go, button stitch on using the universal foot, the open-toed embroidery, and the round embroidery or the darning foot. Okay, so go ahead if you're going to embellish and sew on the rest of your buttons. If you don't want to use your machine, of course you can do it by hand. That's always an option. And you can always add buttons and bits and pieces on once the hat's constructed as well. Okay, so the hat's all trimmed up with buttons. I'm just going to snip off all the scrappy bits of loose thread. So we've got all our threads trimmed off, and I'm now just going to make the dingle dangle to hang on the end of the hat, on the loopy bit of the hat. And again, you can choose whether you want to put this on or not. So they're all individual and you can make them unique. I'm going to use a Christmas tree and some of these little bells to give it a bit of a jingle jangle. And it's just occurred to me that I've been calling this a dingle dangle. I should have been calling it a jingle jangle. We also need a little bead to go on the bottom. I've got a beading needle here already threaded with some 3mm white ribbon, and I'm just going to take the needle through the centre of the Christmas tree, which I'm using as my main feature. Pull it right through the centre there, and then we're going to sew this little bead on the bottom, or thread this little bead on the bottom, because this will prevent the ribbon going back up through, losing it back up through the centre of the tree. Now I'm not actually going to push the needle back in via the point. I'm going to send it with the eye of the needle in first, so that the needle does not catch any of the ribbon that's already in the tree. Should have pulled that a little bit longer, shouldn't I really? Hang on, just make sure we're pulling that the right bit of the ribbon through. There we go. So we've got our Christmas tree and a little bead on the bottom. And then I'm just going to add some of these little bells onto mine to finish off, to create a nice little hanging embellishment. Make sure that they don't slip down onto the top of the tree. I'm just going to tie a little knot in the 2 strands of ribbon to secure them. And then you need to thread your needle again with both bits of the ribbon going through this time. So needle threaded, and we are ready now for our little bells. So I'm going to choose bells that go with the fabric that I've picked for the hat. So I'm going to go with a blue, a pink and a silver. Just thread them on one at a time. Creates a nice little trio. And then taking 2 ribbons, again we're just going to tie a knot, hold the beads in place, nice and secure, and then you've got the lengths of ribbon which you can feed back into your hat. And Sprinkles, my cat, seems to be enjoying sitting on this hat. Excuse me, sweetheart, do you think you could just move a little over, a little? I know, it's not fair, is it? It's just not fair. Gonna go find somewhere else to sleep. Okay, so now we're ready to sew the hat together. Okay, so we've got right side up with our buttons facing, and we're going to now feed our little embellishment in here. I should have said, sorry, there's about 50 centimetres of ribbon here, but you don't need anywhere near 50 centimetres. I mean, you could make it a nice long one if you wanted, but I'm going to make it fairly short, so it just sort of sits around just below the brim of the hat. So a lot of this is going to be trimmed off. And when we're positioning it, we need to make sure that our embellishment is inside the body of the hat, and that the ribbon is just coming towards the edge, and we're going to stitch this in place. So we're going to take the other layer of the hat, place it over, layer it up nice and neatly, and then grabbing some pins, we're just going to pin it in place. Make sure your ribbon's laying one on top of the other. That's the first bit to pin, really, making sure that everything's matching up around that bottom curve. And just pin the ribbon in place. And then pin the rest of the hat together. We're only going to be sewing it around about 5mm. Yeah, that's 5mm seam allowance. It's quite a narrow seam allowance. And this is the reason why we didn't put any of the buttons very close to the edge, because we don't want any buttons in our seam allowance. So pin all the way around, and we're going to be sewing from this edge just above our little triangles there, all the way around the curve of the hat, around the bottom, and finishing here. So we've got a starting point and a finishing point. And at the same time, whilst you're sewing, you might as well be doing the brim at the same time. So again, make sure that you have got your pieces of fleece with right sides facing. There is a right and a wrong way to do this. These fabric pieces should match up, but they are not completely reversible. They don't match up the same. They're not far out, but they don't match up the same. I think I've already said I did draft this pattern a bit freehand, so it's not exactly symmetrical. So again, just a couple of pins, 5mm seam allowance for these as well. And again, we're just sewing this short edge, both sides, the short edge only. 5mm, okay, nicely pinned. Crack on, get them all stitched up. 5mm seam allowance. When you get to the ribbon embellishment, you may just want to back stitch a little there just to secure and hold it in place, because it's a real pain if you lose it and have to unpick and sew it back in. Okay, to the sewing machine. Okay, so all stitched up. You can see it is only a narrow seam allowance. Like I said, just 5mm. Trim off all your loose threads, trim off the scrappy bits of ribbon. We're going to keep the hat, the main body of the hat, the wrong side out, but we're going to flip the brim or trim, whatever you want to call it, to the right side, and then we're going to pin it in place on the hat. And we're going to be pinning seam allowance to seam allowance, essentially. So the brim needs to sit over the hat, so just pull the body of the hat through. So you just got 2 loops of fabric, and then just match up the seams and just put a pin right the way through the middle and hold them together. And then do the same on the other side just to secure it in place. And then we're going to pin all the points of our triangles in place. Now, just to hold it all together, just going to put the pins in horizontally. It may have some misaligned bits of fabric. That doesn't really matter, because actually we can just trim it down once it's stitched in place. I don't know how it's quite happened here, but we've got quite a bit of excess pink showing through. And don't worry, that can all be trimmed later, and we can just pin that in place there just to hold it here and here, and then flip it over to the other side and just pin all those bits again. I'm actually wondering if I've put this brim on the wrong way round, that this edge should possibly be here. Doesn't really matter, because you can just trim it down afterwards. And the section that we're going to sew first is actually this seam. We're just going to join the 2 bits of fleece, so we just want to put a few pins in along this straight edge as well. And you choose your stitch. You can just do a typical running stitch. You can secure it with like an over edging zigzag stitch. Go with a fancy stitch. I'm going to choose a stitch which looks a little bit like a blanket stitch. It's actually the blind hem stitch of the machine, where it does 3 straight stitches and then a little peek in, 3 stitches and a little peek in. It looks quite nice. Here's one that I've done on another hat. I don't know if you can see. It probably looks a bit nicer on the, it's a bit more obvious on the white. You can see how it just embellishes the edges of the hat if you do a slightly different stitch. Okay, so back to the machine and sew around the hat, sewing the 2 layers, sewing the brim to the main body of the hat now. Okay. Now, next bit, final bit almost, is to just sew the triangles, the edges together. I'm going to use that blind hem stitch so that it mimics blanket stitch. Okay. Okay, so we're all stitched together now, so we can take the final pins out. And now is a time for a little bit of quality control. Any little bits of trimming that you want to do if you've got overlaps of fabric, or if your peaks aren't looking perfect and you want to tweak them a little bit, now's the time to do it. So we've got a little bit of fabric shooting out there, and then if you just look at this section here, it's a little bit mismatched, so I'm just going to trim off the pink, being very careful not to catch that nice edge stitching. So just check around your hat, anything that you want to tweak, now is the time to do it before we turn it to the right side out for the big reveal. It's the thing with fleece, it does stretch as you're working it, and you know, the pattern's not been professionally drafted. I have done it by hand, so you know, it may need a bit of tweaking. And one last one, I think. Just a little trim down there. It's lovely. Okay. Any loose threads, random strands, just trim them off. And then we're ready to turn it right sides out. So we're going to go just down to the little curly bottom corner where we've got our jingle jangle embellishment, and flip that out. Just run round the seam with your thumb or your finger just to make sure that it's all pressed out the right way. Pull down your little charm, turn it the right way out, flip back the brim. And if you really do want to jingle all the way, you can maybe sew some of these tiny little cat bells onto the peaks by hand, and then you'll be jingling and jangling wherever you go. So that's how to make a droopy elf hat. Hopefully I'll be back soon with some more scrappy Christmas makes.